It was long past twilight, and the castle halls had gone quiet. Only the occasional creak of the old wooden beams or the rustle of straw from the stable outside could be heard now. Somewhere in the countryside of 13th century England, the fire in the hearth burned low, its glow flickering against the stone walls. In that small space of warmth and shadow, young Edith sat still before a mirror, an object so rare it might as well have been treasure. Her fingers, still rough from laboring with wool and soap, gently traced her face, as if searching for something more than just a reflection. Her mother had once told her that beauty was a woman's best dowry, but Edith never quite understood what that meant. She wasn't the only one confused. In villages, towns, and courts across Europe, beauty was something that shifted with the wind. One year it was pale skin, the next it was wide hips, or hair so tightly bound it nearly gave headaches. Yet for all the fuss, Edith noticed that the men rarely had a change at all. Their clothes could be muddy, their hands cracked and calloused, and still they were praised. But the women? They plucked, scrubbed, powdered, and pinched. Why? That question lingered in Edith's mind longer than she could admit. And she wasn't alone. From scullery maids to noble ladies, from French villages to Italian cities, women spent hours trying to match a beauty ideal that seemed to come from nowhere and yet ruled everything. Even if they couldn't read or write, they understood what was valued. A smooth forehead meant virtue. Thin eyebrows were ladylike. A high forehead that showed intelligence, so some plucked their hairline back, painfully, strand by strand. These standards didn't come from books or studies, but they spread faster than any scroll. The odd part was, most people didn't even question where these ideas came from. Was it the church? Was it the noblewomen at court who set the rules? Or were these standards passed down like old recipes, with each generation adding something new until no one remembered the original ingredients? In distant Florence, a girl named Lucia leaned over a basin of rose water, holding her breath. The scent of crushed petals filled the air. She wasn't preparing for a feast or festival, just for another afternoon of sitting near the window, hoping someone important might pass by and notice her. Her mother dabbed flour across her cheeks, whispering that pale skin showed softness and grace. But the sun didn't care about grace. The sun made her freckles bloom. Each one, she feared, was a mark against her. At the same time, far to the north, a girl named Astrid struggled to braid her long, golden hair into a tight, intricate knot. Her aunt said long hair was a sign of purity, but the comb snagged and tore with every stroke. Astrid wondered, just for a second, why her worth depended on strands of keratin. But then she looked at her cousin, who had chopped her hair short after catching lice, and saw how the boys no longer smiled at her. What was it that made these strange rules stick so tightly to women's lives? In noble households, beauty was a political tool. A beautiful daughter could attract a powerful husband. So from an early age, girls were taught to sit straight, speak softly, and keep their skin unmarked. Some rubbed lead-based powders into their cheeks for a pale glow, not knowing it poisoned them slowly. Others used crushed berries, burnt cork, or sheep's fat to shape the illusion of health. All the while, their brothers ran free in the fields, learning to hunt, ride, and fight. Yet not every woman followed the script. There were rebels, even in quiet ways. Some girls left their cheeks bare. Some let their hair fly wild in the wind. Others, like Edith, looked into the mirror and simply blinked, not out of vanity, but out of wonder, who decided that her nose was too broad or her jaw too square. She had seen paintings in the chapel, angels with narrow faces and almond eyes, saints with delicate fingers and tiny mouths. But those were paintings. She was real, and her face had freckles, a small scar by her chin, and lips that didn't know how to stay closed when she laughed. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Still, the pressure was everywhere. In the manor kitchens, the servants gossiped about Lady Eleanor's new dress and whether her neck looked too long. In the market, vendors teased one another over crooked teeth or spotted hands. Even nuns, who had sworn off worldly things, sometimes sighed at their own reflection while washing up for evening prayers. It was as if beauty had become a quiet religion, practiced by nearly everyone, whether they believed in it or not. Of course, beauty didn't exist in a vacuum. It was tangled up with class, wealth, health, and religion. The whiter the skin, the less time someone spent working outdoors. The thinner the waist, the more likely they had enough to eat. And modesty? That was tied to piety, and women who wore their dresses too low or their hair too loose could be shamed, or worse. But in the villages where mirrors were rare and candles even rarer, the standards bent slightly. There, beauty could mean strong hands, a steady voice, or a kind face after a long day in the fields. There, people whispered stories of grandmothers who healed with herbs, or midwives whose lined faces were seen as proof of wisdom. And maybe, in those tucked-away corners of the world, the pressure eased just a little. And yet, every girl seemed to carry the same question in her chest. Am I enough? Back in her small room, Edith stood up from her stool and peered out the window. The wind rattled the shutters softly, carrying with it the scent of hay and the distant smoke of a dying fire. She heard her father coughing downstairs. Her mother was likely asleep by now. In the reflection of the glass, she saw only shadows and starlight. But something stirred in her heart, a quiet rebellion. She didn't know what it meant yet. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Because while the world measured her by pale skin, thin brows, and a bowed head, Edith had other plans. She just didn't know what they were yet. Outside, a low bell rang from the abbey in the hills, calling monks to their midnight prayers. Somewhere in the valley below, a girl scraped ash from a hearth, her cheeks flushed from heat. Another braided her sister's hair by candlelight. Another fell asleep, crying over a broken engagement. Another stared into the dark and dreamed of something else, something bigger than powder and pins and whispered judgment. What none of them knew, not yet anyway, was that something was beginning to shift, slowly, quietly, like a seed under snow. But the rules of beauty, so tightly held, would not last forever. Not after what was about to happen. Morning came quietly, as it often did in the medieval countryside. The light moved in slow, golden slants across the stone floor, touching everything softly. The corner where a spindle leaned against the wall, the wooden chest that held a few folded linen dresses, and the frayed rug beneath Edith's feet. The rooster's call had already sounded, but no one rushed. In a world without clocks or alarms, time moved differently, measured not by minutes, but by tasks, by light, by sound. Edith reached for her shawl and stepped outside. The air was cool, and a soft mist hovered above the grass. From nearby fields, she could hear the clinking of pails, the low bleating of goats, the lazy rhythm of life as it began again. Her thoughts, though, still lingered on what she saw in the mirror the night before. Or perhaps not what she saw, but what she didn't. There was no sense of certainty, no quiet confirmation that she was what people expected her to be. Just a vague discomfort, like wearing someone else's shoes. She wondered, again, how other girls felt. Did they wake up feeling unfinished? Did they catch their reflection in puddles or pewter plates and feel judged by an invisible standard? Her neighbor, Marjorie, had once tried to dye her hair with elderflower and ash, hoping for the light tones noble women favored. It hadn't worked. Her curls turned brittle and slightly green, and the village boys teased her for weeks. But no one said much about her efforts, because they all knew what she was trying to do. Everyone was trying in their own way. Far away, in a manor perched atop a wooded hill, Lady Cecily turned from her breakfast and stared into her silver plate. The servants had not yet cleared it, but her reflection danced in the ripples of cream and oats. She tapped her fingers against the table, bored and slightly anxious. Her nurse had said she needed more milk for her complexion, but the thought of another mouthful made her sick. She was already pale. She hardly went outside, but her future husband's family valued delicate features, and so she sipped more goat's milk, scrubbed her face with vinegar, and lay for hours beneath silk cloths in dark rooms. No one told her directly what she must do, but everyone seemed to expect it. It wasn't just beauty. It was how beauty became the unspoken requirement for being taken seriously as a woman. You could be clever or kind, but But if your nose curved the wrong way or your skin darkened in the sun, people looked at you differently. If your chin was sharp, they'd whisper that you were cold. If your face was round, they'd say you were simple. No one said these things out loud. They didn't have to. And so it continued, in places big and small, from stone castles to dirt roads. In a convent nestled between two hills, Sister Agnes prepared herbs for a salve. She had taken vows to leave vanity behind, to let go of worldly concerns. But sometimes when she passed the well and caught her reflection, a strange ache would rise in her chest. She was not ugly. She was simply plain, a face made for silence and prayer. But even she remembered a time, before the convent, when someone had called her beautiful, and how that word had made her feel like she belonged in the world. Perhaps beauty was not just appearance. Perhaps it was a kind of permission. In the city of Bruges, cobbled streets echoed with the clatter of carts and the shouts of merchants. There, a young apprentice named Greta watched noble women pass from the shadowed doorway of her master's shop. They wore rich fabrics and carried themselves like living statues. Greta's apron was smudged with ink and dust. She had ink stains on her fingertips, and her hair was always tied back with a scrap of leather. Still, when she saw her reflection in the shop's polished silver cups, she wondered what it would be like to be seen. Truly seen. Not for the work she did, but for something else. She wasn't sure if that was foolish or brave. Back in the countryside, Edith returned from the henhouse with eggs cradled in her apron. Her mother had already started boiling water for the wash. The smell of yeast and ash lingered in the air. Her younger brother, Simon, chased the dog through the muddy yard, his laughter cutting through the morning quiet. No one asked Edith how she felt about her face or her freckles or the small gap in her teeth. They only asked if she had finished her chores. But the questions lived inside her anyway. That night, Edith found herself standing in the same spot, staring at the same mirror. The fire crackled low, casting uneven shadows. This time, she didn't study her face as if it were a puzzle to solve. She just looked, and as she did, a memory drifted back, something her grandmother once told her long ago when Edith had cried over scraped knees and broken threads. Beauty changes with the eye that sees it, her grandmother had said. But kindness, child, that shows in every light. She didn't remember what had brought on the conversation, but the words settled over her now like a warm cloak. It was strange. She didn't know what kindness looked like in a mirror, but maybe she didn't need to. Still, something kept nagging at her, some quiet curiosity about why the world placed so much value on things people couldn't choose. The curve of a nose, the width of a waist, the smoothness of skin, and how those things held so much weight in marriage, reputation, even in daily life. In the next village over, a tinker's daughter had been turned away from an apprenticeship because the master thought she looked too bold. No one could quite explain what that meant, but everyone accepted it, as if a face could threaten someone's comfort, as if a strong brow or a loud laugh could somehow make a girl less trustworthy. Edith wanted to understand why. She didn't want to complain, only to see the shape of the thing that had followed her and her friends like a shadow all their lives. It wasn't just about lips and eyes. It was about who got to feel worthy, who got to be called lovely, who got to be heard. And now, for the first time, Edith wondered if these ideas had always been here, or if they had been planted by someone, somewhere for a reason. Perhaps it went deeper than anyone realized. Perhaps the rules were not only unfair, but designed. She turned from the mirror, the fire now dim behind her. The stars outside blinked coldly in the black sky. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, softly, distantly, and deep inside her chest, something stirred again. A quiet question, not just about beauty, but about power. Because what if the way people saw women's faces was tied to something much bigger? And what if someone, somewhere, wanted to keep it that way? Edith didn't speak of her thoughts the next day. There was little time to think aloud, anyway. Morning blurred into midday, and the hours passed beneath the sun as she helped her mother dye linen, turning rough, colorless cloth into dull blue and faded green. Her hands turned purple from the herbs. The scent of damp wool clung to her sleeves. The chatter around her was light, about the price of grain, a fox that had gotten into the henhouse, and the vicar's upcoming sermon. But underneath it all, her thoughts hummed with quiet restlessness. She wondered how many other girls held the same questions in their minds. How many wondered why beauty mattered so much when there was never enough food, when feet were always sore, when winter came with sharp teeth. And yet somehow, even in hardship, the rules of appearance were never forgotten. They slipped into every room, into every look, into every silence. Somewhere in France, in the walled town of Avignon, a merchant's wife prepared for the feast of St. Catherine. Her maid pulled her corset tighter than usual. The woman winced, but said nothing. The tighter the waist, the more ladylike she appeared. That's what everyone said. And so she endured the pressure, the heat, the bruising that would come later. She didn't question it, not out loud. After all, beauty brought favor. Favor brought comfort, and comfort was rare. But even she, when the door was closed and her reflection was gone, wondered who decided that beauty should hurt. In the city of Prague, a painter dabbed warm colors onto a wooden panel. The Madonna he was working on had long fingers and a face like a crescent moon. The woman he'd used as a model, however, had a rounder face, full cheeks, and a small scar near her eye. He had painted that scar away. He had slimmed the face, softened the jaw. The bishop had insisted on a more holy look. And so, with careful strokes, the woman became someone else. No one would remember her as she truly was. In that way, beauty in the Middle Ages was not just seen, it was constructed, shaped, rewritten. Women were copied into tapestries, into stained glass, into songs and stories, but always filtered through someone else's idea of what beauty should look like. History didn't record the cracked hands of washerwomen, the sunburned cheeks of shepherd girls, or the thick ankles of women who walked miles each day. Instead, it preserved only what it called elegance. And elegance was narrow, pale, quiet. Back in the countryside, Edith's sister, Mary Ann, twisted a ribbon into her hair. She'd heard that boys preferred girls who wore bright colors. She smiled more these days, though Edith could tell it was forced. Her laugh had changed too, higher, quicker. Not long ago, she was bold and loud and didn't care what people said. But since turning 14, something in her had started to fade. Not from weakness, but from watching too closely. Watching what happened to girls who didn't try. Their neighbor, Clara, had once walked with a limp after falling from a wagon. It wasn't severe, but it was enough to keep people talking. They didn't speak cruelly, but they never mentioned her beauty anymore. As if a girl who limped couldn't also be graceful. As if flaws canceled out everything else. And then there was Maud, the baker's daughter, who had lost her front tooth as a child. It was just a tooth, but she covered her mouth when she laughed. She laughed less and less these days. In subtle ways, the world trimmed women into acceptable shapes, like hedges clipped by unseen shears. And the cuts were small, barely felt. But over time, they changed the way girls walked, the way they smiled, the way they dared to dream. At the marketplace, Edith noticed a traveling minstrel selling ballads for a few copper coins. He sang about a fair maiden whose eyes were like the sea and whose skin was like moonlight. The people listened, enchanted. But Edith watched the minstrel's eyes. They moved past every listener except the pretty ones. She wondered if even songs were written only for certain faces. Later, while fetching water, she caught sight of her reflection again, this time in the ripples of the village well. The surface quivered with every drop, but she saw enough. A girl with dark eyes and a thoughtful mouth. Not beautiful, not plain, just real. And it struck her, as it often did lately, how little that seemed to matter. Yet how much it was made to. She wondered what would happen if people stopped playing the game. If girls stopped pinching their cheeks, or lowering their eyes, or lightening their hair with strange powders. Would the world change? Or would it punish them harder? In the abbey, Sister Agnes prepared parchment for a scribe who was copying a manuscript. She read lines between the Latin, references to virtues, to angels, to purity. Every image of a woman was gentle, soft, obedient. She paused, fingers ink-stained, and thought of the girls she knew before the convent. None of them had looked like angels, but they were real, and that seemed worth more. Outside the walls of noble courts, beyond the stained glass windows, the world turned slowly. Seasons changed. Girls became women, and beauty remained a quiet pressure, like a cord gently tightening around the chest. Not enough to stop breath, but enough to shape it. One afternoon, Edith overheard two old women talking by the herb garden. Their hands moved quickly through mint and thyme, but their voices were slow. One spoke of her youth, when fair hair was considered most lovely. The other laughed, saying her time had been different, when girls with round faces were thought lucky. They chuckled, unaware that Edith was listening, but their words clung to her. If beauty could change so often, so easily, was it ever real? She returned home that evening with a strange calm in her bones. The fire was low again. Her brother was asleep, curled like a cat near the hearth. Her mother was mending socks. No one asked her what she was thinking, but the question inside her was louder now. Not sharp, just steady. What if the world's idea of beauty wasn't a truth, but a decision? A decision made long ago, repeated by artists and preachers and mothers, until it became invisible, until it felt like law. She didn't know who made the rules, but she was beginning to see them for what they were. And once seen, rules can be broken. The wind outside began to pick up, carrying the scent of coming rain. Edith leaned closer to the fire, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. There were still dishes to scrub and wool to comb tomorrow. Nothing in her life had changed, but inside her something had. The rain came softly in the night, tapping the thatched roof above Edith's head like a quiet lullaby. She stayed still beneath her wool blanket, listening as the world around her settled into silence. Somewhere in the dark, a shutter creaked. The smell of wet earth crept into the room. Her little brother stirred in his sleep, mumbling something dreamlike, and then all was quiet again. Edith couldn't sleep, not because of worry or fear, but because her mind was too full. Not loud, just full. Thoughts wandered like sheep across an open field, slow and unhurried. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell, old tales of forest spirits and enchanted maidens, of magical lakes and women with hair like spun silver. Those women were always beautiful, always flawless, but they didn't feel real. Even as a child, Edith had felt the distance between those stories and her own reflection. She turned on her side and watched the flicker of dying firelight on the wall. The glow moved like a shadow, sometimes there, sometimes gone. It reminded her of the way beauty worked in her world, fleeting, changeable, and never quite within reach. The moment someone felt confident in their appearance, something would shift. A new fashion, a new rule, a new opinion whispered behind closed doors. It was like chasing mist. Somewhere else, in a manor house surrounded by rose gardens, a girl named Eleonora stared at herself in polished bronze. Her hair had been curled with hot tongs. Her cheeks were rouged. A servant had drawn a line of kohl beneath her eyes. Everyone said she looked perfect, but when she smiled, it didn't feel like her own face looking back. Eleonora had done everything expected. She had studied how to speak softly, how to tilt her head just so, how to walk with grace. And yet, alone in her chamber, she felt tired. Not from the weight of her gown, but from the weight of trying. In the pages of a monk's handwritten book, beauty was described as divine order. Symmetry was holy. A straight nose meant purity. A small mouth meant obedience. These ideas weren't questioned, because they came wrapped in religion and tradition. But Edith didn't think her worth was shaped by her chin or her lashes. She couldn't say why. It just felt wrong. The next morning, Edith rose early. The rain had stopped. Dew clung to every blade of grass. Chickens pecked lazily at the damp earth. The smell of rain lingered in the air like a hymn. She moved slowly, brushing straw from her skirt, and stepped outside to collect herbs for the stew. Her hands worked without thought, her fingers grazing soft leaves, her breath steady. As she walked the garden rows, she paused to watch a bee clumsily tumble through a bloom of lavender. Its movements were awkward, even silly, but beautiful in their own way. Not because the bee was trying to impress anyone, not because it had been told what beauty looked like, but simply because it was being itself, busy, focused, alive. That thought sat with her the rest of the day. In town, There were whispers about a new noble woman visiting from the coast. People said she had hair like candlelight and skin like alabaster. Some said she was the loveliest woman they had ever seen. Others said she wore veils because her beauty was too distracting. No one really knew. Still, the rumors spread like smoke. By the end of the day, 3 girls had tried to curl their hair with hot stones, and one had burned her ear. Edith didn't judge them. She understood the urge. Everyone wanted to feel like they mattered. Everyone wanted to feel seen. But she wondered, was this noblewoman happy? Or was she trapped behind those veils, try to live up to an image she couldn't even touch? At the weaving hall, an older woman named Aldith shared a story while spinning wool. Her voice was soft and steady. She spoke of a girl from her youth who had been considered beautiful by everyone. Men had fought for her. Women had envied her. But the girl had always worn a veil, even in summer heat. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were cautious. She lived like a statue, Aldith said, frozen in perfection. When asked what happened to her, Aldith only shrugged. I think she got tired. Edith thought about that long into the evening. It was strange how beauty was supposed to make life easier, but often did the opposite. The more people admired someone, the less freedom they seemed to have. They became symbols, not people. Painted over, dressed up, watched. Even the tapestries in the chapel, with their saints and queens, showed the same faces over and over. Oval, pale, narrow-eyed. Edith began to see how history shaped expectations, and how those expectations became chains. She remembered something else her grandmother once said during a summer storm. The world will always tell you what you should be, but the sky never changes itself to match anyone's opinion. It hadn't made much sense then, but now it felt like truth. That night, Edith sat with her mother by the fire, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. It didn't speak much. The quiet was comfortable, safe. But when her mother looked over and smiled, just a little, just enough, Edith saw something she hadn't noticed before. Her mother's eyes were tired but kind. Her mouth was crooked from years of smiling unevenly. Her hair was silvering near the temples. And yet, she had never looked more beautiful. Not because of light or lines or features, but because she was real, present, whole. Later, as Edith lay beneath her thin blanket, the wind picked up again. It rattled the shutters. The moonlight spilled across the floor in a broken pattern. She listened to the night sounds, an owl in the trees, the soft creak of wood, the distant rustle of animals in the barn. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Her thoughts weren't heavy anymore, just curious. Why had no one ever told her that beauty didn't have to hurt? Why had no one said it could be gentle? That could be something you felt, not something you performed? And what would happen, she wondered, if enough girls like her asked the same questions? Would the world listen? Or would it pretend not to hear? The fire cracked softly. The stars shifted behind clouds. And in the quiet, Edith began to dream, not of being admired or chosen or praised, but of being known, as she was, fully, without needing to change a single thing. And though she didn't know it yet, she was not alone. The next morning arrived with gray skies and the low hum of wind slipping between the trees. Edith stood at the edge of the field, a woven basket hanging from one arm, her boots damp from the wet grass. The rain had stopped in the night, but the ground was still soft and heavy, pulling at her steps with each motion. Across the field, her father was already tending to the fence line, his figure hunched and steady. She waved once. He didn't see. As she bent to gather herbs from the patch near the tree line, her thoughts drifted again, uninvited. The same questions tugged at her like threads she couldn't find the end of. Why were some women remembered and others forgotten? Why were faces carved into stone? Faces that didn't smile or frown, only looked out across time like masks. She had stared at those faces before, in the old chapel, frozen in stained glass and etched on tombs. Always the same smooth skin, the same faraway eyes. Always perfect, and yet she could never remember their names. Back at the house, Mary Ann was humming while brushing her hair. She had found a broken bit of looking glass in a trader's discard pile, and kept it wrapped in linen like a treasure. Every morning now, she examined her face in it, turning her head this way and that, smoothing her brows, pulling at her cheekbones. She was only 14, but already Edith saw how much time she spent thinking about her looks. Her smile was different now. Tight, practiced, almost polite. Marian had always been bold, louder than anyone, always ready to run into the stream or climb the low apple trees barefoot. But lately, she moved more carefully, more quietly, as if trying to shrink into the kind of girl she thought people preferred. Edith watched her sister without speaking. She knew what she was seeing. Not just someone changing, but someone shrinking. In town that afternoon, the baker's wife mentioned the noblewoman again, the one from the coast who had visited the Baron's manor last week. They said she wore violet silk and smelled of rosewater and cloves. The miller's wife added that she hadn't smiled once during the whole visit. Didn't need to, she said. People listened anyway. A silence followed, and Edith could feel the quiet envy that hung between the women like smoke. No one said it, but they all felt it. The strange power of being looked at, admired, listened to, not for words or work or wisdom, but simply for appearance. Edith thought about that during the walk home. It puzzled her how something as fragile as beauty could be so powerful, and yet it ruled nearly everything. Even in her village, where no one had gold, where hands were calloused and backs were bent from labor, people still noticed who was fairer, who had finer features, who moved with more grace. It was like some hidden scale everyone carried, weighing worth by what met the eye. That evening, after the sun dipped behind the hills, Edith visited her friend Ellen. They sat in the barn, the scent of hay thick in the air, as chickens rustled nearby. Ellen had always been clever, quicker with numbers than most of the boys in the village. She once dreamed of learning letters from the parish clerk, but that had ended when her uncle refused to pay the extra fee. Better to learn spinning, he'd said. No husband wants a woman full of books. Ellen didn't speak of that anymore. But sometimes, when they sat like this in the quiet, Edith could see the thoughts flickering behind her friend's eyes, like candles behind a shutter. Tonight, though, Ellen spoke first. Do you ever think we're supposed to pretend we don't notice? Notice what? Edith asked, though she already had a guess. Ellen picked at a piece of straw. How we all play the same game. How we act like beauty doesn't matter, but everything proves that it does. Every song, every story, every smile. Edith nodded slowly. And how no one really knows where it started. There was a pause. Then Ellen added, almost in a whisper, my cousin cut her arms last winter. Edith turned quickly. What? What? She said her betrothed called her ugly. Said her nose looked like a farmer's. Edith swallowed hard. Is she? She's married now. Ellen said, to someone else. He doesn't seem to care about her nose. But she still wears sleeves, even in summer. The barn felt colder after that. The chickens settled in their nests, and the wind outside rustled the trees gently. Edith stared at the wooden beams above them and felt the silence press against her skin. This wasn't just about beauty. It was about how people were made to feel small, how one cruel word could change the shape of a girl's heart. She wanted to say something comforting, but there were no good words, only questions, and a slow, growing sense that something had been wrong for a very long time. That night, she dreamed of the mirror again, but it wasn't in her home this time. It was in a high room of a stone tower, surrounded by velvet and silk, where hundreds of women stood in a circle, each one staring into the glass, seeing a different face, none of them their own. When she woke, the feeling of that dream clung to her like mist. It didn't frighten her, but it stayed. Over the next few days, the air turned colder. People began to speak of winter, of firewood and preserves, of sealing windows and mending cloaks. Life moved forward as it always did, and yet under the surface, Edith felt the tension building. Not loud, not sharp, but steady, like the sound of something cracking slowly underweight. She started watching more carefully, the way women spoke to each other, the way girls lowered their eyes when praised or teased, the way some laughed too quickly, too brightly, to cover something else. And she noticed the absence, too. The way no one ever questioned why they all tried so hard to meet an idea they hadn't chosen. Something about that felt dangerous. Because if you never questioned the rules, how would you know they were real? Or if someone had made them up, and what if those rules served someone else? The fire in the hearth was low again that night. The moon cast a dim light through the window, just enough to catch her reflection in the glass. It was faint, almost like a ghost. But this time, Edith didn't flinch. She met her own gaze and waited. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew the questions weren't going away, and neither was she. The days grew shorter as October slid into November. The sky turned grayer, the air sharper. A cold wind swept through the trees in the morning, and the smell of wood smoke lingered all day long. Edith wrapped herself in thicker shawls now, her hands often red and raw from the chill. But the cold didn't quiet her thoughts. If anything, they became sharper, clearer in the cold. It was as if something had cracked open inside her, and now the questions that once hovered in the background had come to sit beside her like old companions. She still did her work, milking the goats, sweeping the hearth, twisting yarn, but her thoughts wandered freely. Her mother noticed once or twice. "You're quieter these days," she said over a bowl of steaming broth. Edith only smiled and said, "Just thinking." That was all, and that was enough. In the village square, the talk turned to the harvest feast. The Baron's family would visit again. There would be a small gathering with music and food, and the girls would wear ribbons and flowers in their hair. Some were already preparing. The weaver's daughter, Joan, had begun applying crushed berries to her cheeks each morning. She'd seen it in a traveling minstrel show. "It makes the skin glow," she said with a grin. Or so they say. Edith watched her dab the red stain across her face and saw something both joyful and uncertain. There was nothing wrong with the color. It was the reason behind it that made her pause. Joan didn't seem happy when the color went on. She seemed careful, almost anxious, as if each brush of red was a question. Am I better now? Am I enough? Later that evening, Edith walked the edge of the woods near the old church. It was quiet there, and the leaves were beginning to fall in earnest. The trees whispered with each breeze, their bare arms reaching upward like silent witnesses. She stepped over roots and moss, thinking about the women who used to come here to gather herbs or pray or simply be alone for a while. Women who had lived and aged and disappeared, leaving behind no portraits, no statues, no names carved into stone. She thought about how many of them must have been beautiful in their own way, and how no one would ever know, because no one wrote about the beauty of crow's feet or thick fingers or broad noses. No one told stories about the curve of the back after years of carrying children or the lines around the mouth from laughter or grief. Beauty, as it was remembered, always seemed frozen at 18, smooth, quiet, delicate. But Edith had begun to feel something different. A new kind of beauty, one that didn't sit in mirrors or paintings, one that moved through voices, hands, small gestures. A girl helping her mother peel turnips, a woman singing softly to herself while stacking firewood, a wrinkled hand smoothing down a child's hair. No one praised these things, but they stayed with her. The next day, as she helped her sister braid her hair, Edith paused. Mary Ann's eyes flickered up in the glass. "Is it wrong?" she asked. Edith blinked. "No, not wrong. Just tight." Mary Ann bit her lip. "Tighter looks better." Edith hesitated, then gently loosened the braid just a little. "Comfort looks better." For a moment, their eyes met, and in that silence, a kind of truce passed between them. Mary Ann didn't speak, but she didn't tighten the braid again either. The days slipped by slowly, filled with preparations for winter. Potatoes were stored. Apples were dried. Blankets were mended. And still, the quiet truth lingered. The world asked women to be beautiful, but never explained why. In Florence, many miles away, a young noblewoman was learning to paint. Her tutor allowed it only because her father insisted it would improve her marriage prospects. "A woman with delicate hands and careful vision is more desirable," he had said. The girl did not care for desire. She cared for shape and shadow, for the play of light on cloth, for the way a face changed in different hours of the day. One afternoon, she painted a portrait of her maid. Full lips, strong nose, one eyebrow higher than the other. Her tutor scolded her. You must refine her, he said. Soften the lines. Straighten the features. But the girl refused. For the first time, she left the painting as it was. Unflattering, perhaps, but true. And in that truth, she found more beauty than in all the portraits she had ever copied. Edith didn't know this girl, but the same feeling lived in both of them. One crisp morning, Edith was sent to deliver herbs to the healer, an older woman named Merwin who lived on the edge of the woods. People whisper about her sometimes, called her strange, said she knew things no one should. But Edith liked her. She had a sharp wit and a kind face, full of creases and soft eyes. As they sat sipping nettle tea, Merwin studied Edith for a moment. "You've been thinking heavy thoughts," she said. Edith smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious?" Merwin shrugged. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." There was a pause. Then Edith asked quietly, "Why does beauty matter so much?" The old woman stirred her tea. "Because it's easier to control someone when they care about being liked." Edith sat still. The answer wasn't surprising, but hearing it aloud made her heart ache. Merwin continued, "They tell you what's beautiful, so you'll chase it. Spend your coins on it. Break yourself over it. And once you do, they can tell you when you've failed." Edith looked down at her hands. There was nothing delicate about them. Her nails short, her fingers cracked from wool and ash. She'd never seen hands like hers in paintings, but they had done more good than any mirror ever had. She left Merwin's cottage with a light step and a heavier heart. Not in a sad way, but in the way that comes from realizing a truth you can't unknow. The forest air was cold, but the sun had broken through the clouds. It touched the tops of the trees, turning the brown leaves gold. At home, she found her mother humming while folding cloth. Her brother was carving shapes into a bit of bark. The fire crackled gently. She sat beside them without speaking. Something was changing. Not the world, not yet, but something inside her. And sometimes that was where change had to begin. That night, a cold wind swept across the village rooftops. The shutters rattled, and the embers in the hearth glowed low and orange. Edith lay awake again, not from worry, but from something else, something softer. Her thoughts were quieter now, but still wide awake, like a candle that wouldn't quite go out. She thought of Merwin's words. It's easier to control someone when they care about being liked. The truth of it sank in deeper the more she repeated it to herself. How many women had bent themselves into smaller versions of who they were, just to fit the image someone else had drawn? She thought of her mother's worn hands, always moving, kneading dough, weaving, folding, healing. No one ever called her mother beautiful. But Edith did. She had always thought so, even as a child. And now she realized why. Her mother's face, her body, her voice, they were all full of life. And maybe that was the thing no one ever mentioned, beauty that didn't shine or shimmer but stayed. Quietly, without praise. The next morning, the village was blanketed in frost. The grass crunched beneath her shoes as she stepped outside. Across the path, old Mr. Taylor was repairing a fence with slow, stiff movements. He waved at her, and she nodded in return. Farther off, Mary Ann was helping the weaver's daughter gather fallen apples. Their laughter floated through the cold air. It was a sweet sound, a real one. She watched as her sister smiled, an unpracticed smile, the kind that came from forgetting to worry. And for the first time in weeks, Edith felt a soft warmth spread through her chest. Not everything had to be questioned. Some things, like a good laugh on a cold morning, simply were. Still, the thoughts came and went as they pleased. That was the way of them. Some days, Edith felt clear. Other days, her mind tangled itself around all the things she couldn't quite name. But she let it be. She didn't rush to fix the thoughts anymore. Just like spinning wool, some knots could only be worked through slowly. Later that week, during a rare visit from a traveling bard, Edith listened as he told a tale of a princess who hid her face behind a golden veil. The people of her kingdom believed she was the most beautiful woman in the land. Kings came to win her hand, offering gifts and promises. But when at last she lifted her veil, they were shocked. She had a scar across her cheek, and her eyes were two different colors. Some said she was cursed. Others said she had tricked them. But Edith didn't hear a curse in the story. She heard a woman finally choosing to show herself. That night, she rewound the tale in her mind, letting it settle in pieces. Was the scar what made them turn away? Or was it the fact that she hadn't warned them first? That she'd allowed them to build their fantasies without correction? Either way, the men had run, and the princess had stayed. And, somehow, that made her stronger than all of them. The story lived in Edith's mind for days. It wasn't like the others. There was no wedding at the end, no soft ending wrapped in ribbons and sighs. There was only truth. And maybe Edith thought that was the most powerful thing a woman could carry. Not charm, not beauty, but honesty. In the days that followed, the season shifted further. The trees stood bare now, their branches black against pale skies. People spoke of snow. The animals grew quieter. Even the air seemed slower, more thoughtful. And with the stillness came space. Space for Edith's questions to breathe. Space for her to wonder what came next. One evening, she sat by the fire with her little brother curled beside her, already half asleep. Her mother was knitting in the dim light, her fingers moving without thought. Edith cleared her throat softly. "Did you ever want to look different?" she asked. Her mother looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Your face. Your hair. Did you ever want to change it?" A silence passed. The only sound was the soft click of needles and the crackle of burning wood. Then her mother spoke. "When I was your age, yes. I thought I was too tall. My ears stuck out. I had freckles I couldn't scrub away." She smiled faintly. "But then I got older, and life got louder than the mirror." Edith smiled too. "You don't mind now?" Her mother shook her head. "Not anymore. These days, I just want to feel well. I want to laugh without pain in my knees. I want to taste my food, see my children grow. Beauty fades, but comfort stays. Comfort." The word wrapped itself around Edith like a shawl. That night, she slept better. Winter crept in slowly, one morning at a time. The first snow came soft and thin, like dust falling from the sky. Children cheered, dogs barked, and the world turned white. In the hush of that snowfall, everything felt new, clean, still. Edith went to the well to gather water. The snow clung to the bucket's handle, and her breath came out in little clouds. She stood for a long moment, looking around. The fields were quiet, the woods were sleeping, and the village, tucked into the earth like a secret, felt somehow safe. Safe enough for change. Later, as she swept the kitchen floor, she thought again of all the women she had heard stories about. Some remembered only for their loveliness, their delicate voices, their fine gowns. And yet none of that had lasted. No one remembered what they said, what they felt, just how they looked in candlelight. But Edith wanted more than that. She wanted to be remembered for her steadiness, for her laugh, for the way she helped her brother without asking, for the way she noticed things other people missed. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to meet anyone's idea of beauty to matter. Maybe being kind was enough. Maybe being curious was brave. And maybe, in a world full of rules written by others, being yourself was the quietest form of rebellion. She didn't have all the answers. She still had days where she wished her face looked different. But now, she noticed the feeling. She gave it space, and then she let it pass. Because the mirror was no longer a judge. It was just a piece of glass. The snow didn't stop. It kept falling gently day after day, covering the world in a white stillness that made every sound feel louder and every movement slower. Edith's days were filled with little tasks, hauling water, feeding the chickens, gathering firewood, helping her mother with stitching. On the surface, everything looked normal. But inside, something was shifting. Not just in her, but in others too. The silence of winter had a way of making people think. And when people think too long, questions rise to the surface. Edith noticed it first in the way girls spoke to each other. They had always shared secrets and laughter, but now their words were sharper, their glances more guarded. Joan had begun wearing a new ribbon every day, even when they stayed inside. She said it was just for fun, but Edith could tell she was watching for reactions, looking to see who noticed. Marianne had stopped eating much, saying she wanted to look leaner in her winter dress. She picked at her bread, then smiled as if it didn't matter. Edith didn't press her, but the unease settled deep in her chest. One afternoon, Edith overheard a group of women talking near the chapel. They spoke in low voices about a girl from the next village who had run off with a merchant. Some said she had been foolish, chasing adventure. Others said she had simply wanted a life where she felt seen. She was always trying to make herself prettier, one of the women said with a sigh. Should have known it wouldn't end well. The word stayed with Edith, not because of the gossip, but because no one asked why the girl felt she had to leave in the first place. No one wondered what might have been missing in the life she left behind. At night, Edith sat by the fire and watched the flames flicker across the wooden walls. Her brother slept close to the hearth, and her mother's needles clicked steadily as she worked by candlelight. But the warmth didn't ease the questions in her mind. Why did beauty have such power? Why did it matter more than kindness or cleverness or strength? She didn't know where to take her questions. The church spoke of modesty and obedience. The old song spoke of fair maidens with golden hair. The boys in the village spoke of girls in whispers, always naming the ones they found most lovely. It was a quiet pressure, like snow slowly piling on a roof. No one complained aloud, but everyone felt it, and some began to break under the weight. At the edge of the village, a new family had moved in, quiet people who kept mostly to themselves. They had a daughter, Clara, who was around Edith's age. Clara had a birthmark on her cheek and a limp in one leg. She rarely came into the square, and when she did, she looked at the ground. People didn't speak to her much. They weren't cruel, just distant, as if her difference made them unsure of what to say. One day, Edith saw her walking alone near the frozen stream. Clara's limp was more visible on the ice, but she didn't seem bothered. She looked peaceful, lost in thought. Edith hesitated, then called out a greeting. Clara looked surprised, then smiled. A small, honest smile that made her face shine in a way no ribbon or powder ever could. They talked for a while, nothing deep, just about the weather, the birds, the way the snow made the world feel softer. But afterward, Edith couldn't stop thinking about how much Clara must carry, just to live in a world that looked at her and saw only what was different. It made her angry, not at Clara, but at everything else. At the rules no one ever spoke aloud, but always followed. At the way kindness was so often overlooked, buried under layers of false perfection. As winter deepened, tensions grew in quiet places. Marianne and Joan began whispering more, hiding things in cloth bundles under the bed. Edith found out later they were trying to make their own beauty potions, using ground berries, melted fat, crushed flower petals. One night, Marianne burned her skin trying to heat the mixture too fast. She cried softly in the corner, refusing to let anyone see her face. Edith sat with her for a long time in the dark. She didn't scold or ask why. She just held her hand and waited. Marianne didn't speak, but the silence said enough. It said she was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of chasing something that always stayed just out of reach. Outside, the snow kept falling. The trees stood still, and Edith began to realize that the true struggle wasn't between girls. It was between each girl and the invisible voice inside her that kept whispering, "You're not enough." That voice came from everywhere, from paintings, from songs, from stories passed down like recipes. But no one ever asked who had written them. No one asked who got to decide what beauty looked like. At the chapel, the old priest gave a sermon about purity. He spoke of virtue and modesty, and how a woman's worth was tied to her grace and gentleness. Edith watched the faces of the women around her, tired, worn, some hollow. None of them looked inspired. They looked judged. When the priest finished, they bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in habit. Afterward, Clara found her outside the chapel. She said softly, "Do you ever feel like they're talking about someone who isn't real?" Edith nodded. All the time. They walked together in silence, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Around them, the world looked peaceful, but the tension was growing stronger beneath the surface. Like frost under the soil, waiting for a thaw to reveal what it had done. Clara spoke again. "I heard someone say once that beauty is a kind of trap. You chase it until you forget where you were going." Edith looked at her and said, "What if we just stopped chasing?" Clara didn't answer right away, but the look in her eyes said she had thought the same thing. And that Edith knew was the start of something. Not a solution, not a fix, but a shift. A small one, yes, but still a shift. Because change never comes all at once. It begins quietly, with a question, and then another. The snow grew deeper with each passing day, pressing into the village with a soft but steady weight. Paths that were once well-worn disappeared under the white, and the old tree near the chapel leaned harder into the wind. Everything felt slower. The days were quiet, the nights long, and the fire never quite seemed enough. Inside the cottage, the air was heavy with the scent of broth, damp wool, and smoke. Edith sat near the hearth, helping her mother mend a tear in the corner of a blanket. Her fingers moved carefully, and though her eyes were on the cloth, her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking of the girls, of Joan's burned cheek, of Marianne's silence, of Clara's question outside the chapel. She kept thinking about the priest's voice, full of certainty, and how none of it felt right anymore. The world she had grown up and had always followed unspoken rules. Girls should smile, but not speak too loudly. They should be modest, but still pleasing. They should want marriage, but not ask too many questions. These rules were not written, but they shaped everything. They shaped how people talked to her, how they looked at her, how they expected her to move through the world. But Edith's thoughts didn't move quietly anymore. When she spoke to Clara again, it was while fetching water from the well. The sky was a dull gray, and flakes of snow floated in slow spirals around them. Clara had pulled her hood low, but her breath showed in the air. "I think it's worse because no one admits it," Edith said quietly. Clara tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "They all act like it's our choice, like we enjoy chasing beauty. But it's never really been ours, has it? It's like we're given a script, and if we don't follow it, we disappear." Clara nodded. "And if we do follow it, we disappear in a different way." The words settled between them like falling snow. Back at home, Marianne was trying to make a new kind of salve, one that would lighten the skin. She said she read about it from an old merchant who claimed pale skin showed wealth. That meant time indoors, away from the sun, away from labor. Edith didn't say much at first, but something inside her turned. Her sister, clever, curious Marianne, was boiling eggshells and vinegar, convinced the shade of her skin determined her worth. She tried to speak gently. "You don't need it, you know." Marianne didn't look up. "I do. Joan says the Baron sons are coming to the feast next week." Edith blinked. And they'll be looking," Marianne said. "Maybe not for someone like me, but I can try." The words stung, not because of what they meant, but because they weren't surprising. Edith thought of her father, quiet and hard-working, who had once told her, "People will always try to sell you things to fix what was never broken." But it wasn't just merchants anymore. It was the songs, the stories, the silences. The way praise was handed out only to those who looked a certain way. The way older women were treated as invisible. The way joy was measured in compliments. The feast loomed closer, and with it, the sense of pressure grew. The girls practiced braiding their hair. Some borrowed shoes. Some begged their mothers for lavender oil or bits of lace. There was excitement, yes, but also anxiety, unspoken, but visible in every mirror glance and every whispered comparison. Edith noticed that even Clara began brushing her hair more carefully. The day before the feast, Edith visited Merwin again. The old woman was sorting dried herbs, her fingers nimble despite the cold. "Your mind's louder than usual," Merwin said without looking up. Edith sat down beside her. "Do you think it's wrong to care about how we look?" Merwin stopped. "Wrong? No, but it's dangerous to believe that's all we are." Edith looked at the baskets around the room, full of roots, leaves, dried flowers. "It's hard to remember that when the world won't stop reminding you." Merwin gave a dry chuckle. "That's the trick, isn't it? To build your own mirror, one that shows more than what others want to see." Edith didn't answer, but she thought about it all the way home. That night, Marianne stood in front of the little piece of mirror and frowned. The salve hadn't worked the way she hoped. Her skin was red in places, irritated. She tried to cover it with crushed petals. Edith came to her side and rested a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to go," she said. Marianne looked away. "If I don't, they'll think I wasn't good enough." Edith paused. If they only see your face, they were never looking at you. The words didn't fix anything. But for a moment, Marianne let herself lean into the touch. Just for a moment. The day of the feast arrived with clear skies and biting wind. People gathered in the chapel hall, dressed in their finest. The Baron's family stood at the far end, speaking softly, their clothes lined with fur and embroidery. Laughter echoed across the hall, but it was the kind that felt rehearsed. Edith stood near the back with Clara, watching as girls curtsied and smiled. Joan was radiant, her hair tied with a green ribbon that caught the candlelight. Marianne stood near her, quiet, her eyes flicking toward the Baron's sons, then quickly away. When Clara caught Edith looking, she whispered, "They all look like ghosts of themselves." Edith nodded. "They're trying to become what they think will be loved." For a while, they said nothing more, just watched. It wasn't that the feast was unpleasant. The food was warm, the music cheerful. But underneath it all, Edith felt something simmering, an ache that no one named, a hunger that praise never filled. She saw it in the eyes of the girls when the Baron's sons glanced past them. She saw it in the way the women straightened their backs, tugged at their sleeves, checked their hair when they thought no one was watching. And she saw it in herself, too. That quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would say she was lovely. That old part of her, still waiting to be chosen. But then Clara squeezed her hand, just once. And Edith remembered. They didn't need to be chosen to matter. And they didn't need to be perfect to be seen. They just needed to be real. The days after the feast felt quieter than before. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way that follows something unresolved. The laughter from the chapel hall didn't echo for long. The compliments that were passed around that night, who wore what, who caught a glance, began to fade like smoke in the air. But the weight of those moments stayed behind. Edith saw it in the way girls walked afterward, in the way they sat together, silent more often than not. Something had shifted, and no one quite knew how to speak about it. Marian barely touched her food. She spent more time in bed, staring at the ceiling or brushing the same section of hair again and again. Her cheek had begun to heal, but the red marks were still there, faint but stubborn. She avoided the mirror now, folding it away in cloth like something that might bite. Edith watched her sister and felt helpless. Words didn't come easily anymore. The closer they grew, the harder it became to say what needed to be said. She wanted to tell her that none of this should matter, that her worth wasn't tied to the boys who didn't notice her, or the skin that wouldn't turn pale, or the ribbon she never wore. But even as those thoughts formed, she heard the quiet voice inside, the same one that whispered to her, too. What if it doesn't matter? What if this is the only measure anyone sees? She hated that voice, but she couldn't ignore it either. That week, the cold deepened. A frost came that cracked the corners of windows and turned the well water to slush. Fires had to be fed constantly. People stayed indoors longer, speaking less. There was talk that another storm was coming, a hard one, like the kind that sealed doors shut and froze the roads for days. Inside the cottage, Edith sat with her hands near the fire, staring at the small flames as they danced. Clara had started visiting more often. Sometimes she brought herbs or dried fruit from her mother. Sometimes she came with nothing at all, just her presence. They didn't always speak. Lately, they found more comfort in the silence between them. But today, Clara said something that made Edith's breath catch. "You know," she said, voice low, "I used to try and hide my limp. I'd walk slower, cover it with my skirts. I hated the way people looked at me, like I'd been made wrong." Edith turned to her. "You don't do that now." Clara gave a faint smile. "No, but I still feel it, especially when I see how everyone else tries so hard to look right. Like there's some perfect version of us we're all supposed to chase." Edith felt that truth settle into her like a weight. She had never admitted it aloud, but she had spent so much of her life trying to appear acceptable. Not loud, not strange, not plain. Just enough to be liked, but not so much as to be noticed too sharply. Somewhere along the way, the act had become a habit. At the village, 2 days later, Edith overheard a group of older women talking. They spoke of their daughters, of how the younger girls were becoming distracted. One said her niece had stopped attending services regularly. Another said her daughter had begun reading borrowed letters. learning words she had no use for. One voice lowered and said, "They think too much these days. Thinking leads to trouble." Edith turned her face away, but her stomach churned. That night, Merwin sent word asking Edith to come by before the snowstorm arrived. When she arrived, the old woman handed her a bundle of dried herbs, but her eyes were serious. "There's talk," she said quietly. "Some people think the girls are becoming disobedient, that someone's been putting ideas in their heads." Edith's pulse quickened. What kind of ideas? Merwin didn't blink. That they don't need to follow the old ways. That beauty shouldn't be worshipped. That being seen shouldn't cost so much. Edith swallowed hard. "And they think that's dangerous?" "They always do," Merwin said. "Because if a woman stops caring what others think of her, she becomes harder to control." The tension in Edith's chest built like a storm cloud. She had never thought of herself as dangerous. She wasn't loud. She didn't argue or push. But now, simply by asking questions, by choosing silence over performance, she had drawn attention, and not the kind anyone wanted. Back at home, she found Marianne staring at the window, her face unreadable. Edith sat beside her. They didn't speak at first. Then Marianne whispered, "They said I looked tired at the feast. One of the Baron's sons told Joan he thought I was sickly." Edith closed her eyes. "I tried so hard," Marianne said. Her voice cracked. "I did everything I was supposed to." Edith reached for her hand. "You did nothing wrong." "But it wasn't enough," she said. "I wasn't enough." Edith held her tighter. "No, you were simply seen by people who don't know how to look." The storm came that night. Thick snow fell like a curtain, burying the roads, silencing the village. The wind howled through the trees, and even the fire seemed unsure of itself. Families stayed indoors, whispering stories, holding tight to blankets and each other. Outside, the world disappeared beneath white. Inside, something else stirred. The next day, rumors began spreading, quiet but sharp, that some girls were being questioned, that someone had asked the priest to speak again, this time more sternly, that the Baron's household was concerned about unrest. Edith knew it wasn't just about beauty anymore. It was about control, about keeping girls quiet, uncertain, small. At the chapel, Clara whispered, "They're going to ask names." Edith's breath hitched. "Who told you?" "It doesn't matter," Clara said. "It's spreading. They think someone's encouraging rebellion." Edith looked around at the chapel walls. The stained glass windows glowed with soft light, showing images of saints and angels, all of them serene, flawless, perfect, none of them real. The storm outside had passed, but a new one was forming inside the village. Edith felt it deep in her bones. A shift was coming, one that couldn't be undone. Girls were waking up. Questions were being asked, and those in power were beginning to notice. But the most frightening part wasn't the conflict itself. It was the question Edith now carried with her, heavier than ever. What would they do to silence it? And was she ready for what came next? The next morning was unusually still. The sky was pale, with no sun but no clouds either, just a heavy, cold quiet that pressed down on the village like a lid. Even the birds didn't sing. Edith woke early, her breath visible in the cold air of the room. The fire had died down to faint embers, and the silence outside seemed to stretch for miles. She dressed slowly, wrapping her shawl tightly and pulling on her boots. Something in the air felt different, the kind of quiet that came before something broke. When she stepped outside, the snow crunched underfoot, but even the sound felt distant. She walked toward the chapel, unsure why, only knowing that something was about to happen. When she reached the square, she saw people already gathered, small groups of villagers whispering, bundled against the cold. The chapel doors were open. Inside, the priest was pacing slowly near the altar, speaking to two men Edith didn't recognize. They wore coats trimmed with fur and heavy boots. Their faces were stern. Clara stood near the back, her arms crossed tightly. Edith joined her, heart beating louder now. "They're from the Baron's household," Clara whispered. "They've come to ask questions." Edith's breath caught. "About us." Clara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The priest turned and gestured for the people to enter. One by one, villagers stepped inside, filling the pews. The air was thick with unspoken worry. No one smiled. No one whispered. When the priest began to speak, his voice echoed sharply off the stone walls. He talked about obedience, about tradition, about the dangers of pride and vanity. He warned of shadows creeping into the minds of our daughters, of foreign ideas that seek to undo the order of things. Edith sat frozen. Each word felt like a pointed arrow. "They've noticed," Clara whispered. The priest didn't say names. Not yet, but his meaning was clear. Certain girls, those who questioned too often, those who no longer bowed their heads quite as low, were being watched. After the service, the men spoke privately with the priest. Some of the villagers lingered near the chapel doors, casting cautious glances at one another. A few looked at Edith. A few more looked at Clara. But no one spoke. On the walk home, Edith's thoughts raced. The words from the chapel ran circles in her mind. Tradition, order, obedience. Words meant to quiet, not to guide. Words that pressed like stones on the chest. That evening, Mary Ann approached her. "I heard them say your name," she said. Her voice was thin, like a thread pulled too tight. "They think you're the reason some of us have changed." Edith turned slowly. "Change how?" "They mean thinking," Mary Ann said, "and asking questions." There was no anger in her voice, only fear. "They might speak to Merwin, too," Mary Ann added. "They've never liked her." Edith sat down at the edge of the bed. The weight of it all settled around her like the snow, cold, still, but impossible to ignore. She thought about the other girls, about Clara, brave in her quiet way, about Joan, who still smiled but whose laughter had grown brittle, about Mary Ann, now curled so tightly into herself she barely spoke aloud anymore. None of them had started this to cause trouble. They were simply tired of chasing something they never chose, tired of being told what was enough, what was beautiful, what was worth noticing. And now, because of that weariness, they had become a threat. That night, Edith made a choice. She waited until the house was quiet, then wrapped herself in her cloak and stepped into the cold. The moonlight turned the snow blue beneath her feet. She walked through the woods toward Merwin's cottage, the only sound her own breath in the air. When she arrived, the old woman opened the door before she could knock. "You felt it too, didn't you?" Merwin said. Edith nodded. "They're going to come. Maybe not tonight, but soon." Merwin looked tired, but not surprised. She gestured for Edith to come in. Inside, the herbs hung silent in the rafters. The fire crackled, and for a moment, it felt like any other winter night. "I don't know what to do," Edith said. "They think we're dangerous just for noticing things." Merwin sat across from her, hands resting on her knees. "You can't stop people from being afraid of change. All you can do is decide whether you'll be quiet or not." Edith looked into the fire. "But if I speak, they might blame the others. They might hurt Clara or Mary Ann." Merwin was silent for a long time. Then she said, "They already are, just in quieter ways." Edith felt tears rise, not the sharp kind, but slow, like rain on a roof. "I'm scared," she whispered. Merwin reached for her hand. "So was I. When I was young, I used to think silence would keep me safe. But all it did was make the world smaller." Outside, the wind picked up, and the trees swayed in the dark. "You don't have to shout," Merwin said. "You just have to keep being yourself, even when they tell you not to." Edith stayed for a while longer, listening to the fire, feeling her breath slow again. When she finally walked home, the sky was beginning to lighten, a pale gray, full of snow and promise. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if her name would be called, or if she would be punished, or if her sister would turn away from her completely. But she did know one thing now, deep in her bones. She would not disappear quietly. And that, somehow, was the beginning of everything. The morning that followed was colder than most. The sun barely touched the rooftops, and frost clung to every surface like glass. Edith stirred slowly from sleep, but something felt wrong the moment she opened her eyes. The quiet of the house had changed. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air was holding its breath. From the other room, she heard voices, too many for such an early hour. Low, firm, unfamiliar. She rose carefully and stepped into the hallway, heart already beating fast. Her mother stood near the doorway, hands folded, her face pale. Two men in dark coats stood just beyond the threshold. One of them was holding a folded piece of parchment. The seal was red. They asked for Merwin. They said there were concerns about her teachings, about her influence on young women. They said she'd been seen giving advice not aligned with the chapel's guidance. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. The formality of their tone made it worse, like a sentence was already written and this was just a formality. Edith stepped forward without thinking. She's done nothing wrong. The taller man glanced at her, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The look said enough. You're part of this too. Later that day, word spread quickly. Merwin had been taken for questioning. Escorted from her home, her cottage left open to the cold. No one had stopped them. Some watched from their windows. A few whispered prayers, but no one stood in the way. Clara arrived at Edith's door before sunset. Her eyes were wild, her hands shaking. They think she's been spreading lies, that she's trying to undo what's proper. They say girls are starting to refuse marriage arrangements. Edith closed her eyes. The pressure had always been there, but now it was solid. Real. No longer whispered. They think it started with you, Clara said softly. Edith felt her breath leave her lungs. But it didn't, Clara added quickly. It started long before. You just said out loud. The fear in her voice was real, but beneath it was something else too. Resolve. And that scared Edith even more. Because when fear turns to courage, something always shifts, and not everyone survives the shift. That evening, Mary Ann returned from the bakery in tears. She had overheard two women saying girls who asked too many questions were bringing shame to their families. They said the Baron's sons had chosen not to return for the winter gathering because the village girls weren't proper. It wasn't said with pity. It was said with blame. Mary Ann wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak. She lay in bed and turned away when Edith tried to sit beside her. The guilt settled like stone. The next day, Edith went to Merwin's cottage. The door creaked open slowly. Inside, everything was still but not untouched. Dear bundles had been torn down. Paper scattered. The hearth was cold. A piece of broken clay lay near the corner, one of the jars Merwin had kept for herself. Edith walked through the room carefully, touching nothing, afraid that even breathing might disturb what remained. On the table was a torn scrap of parchment, weighted down by a small stone. Her name was written on it. Just that. Nothing more. But it was enough. Merwin had known they were coming. She took the note and slipped it inside her coat, heart pounding. On the way home, she passed the chapel. The priest stood outside, speaking to a small group. He held a small book, his voice calm and even, but his eyes were sharp. He looked up once and met Edith's gaze. Neither of them looked away. It was a moment that said everything. She had not spoken aloud, had not stood in the square or written letters or given any speech, but still, she was seen. She had become a symbol without intending to. That night, Clara appeared again. There's a list, she said, of girls they're watching. It's not official, but it exists. I saw it. Edith swallowed hard. Who else? Clara named 3 girls. All of them had been at Merwin's recently. All of them had been asking questions. All of them had, in one way or another, stopped trying to be what was expected. They're calling it a sickness of thought, Clara whispered. They say it spreads. And, suddenly, Edith understood. This wasn't just about beauty. It never had been. That was just the surface. What was really being feared, what the Baron's men and the priest couldn't control, was something deeper. Girls had started listening to themselves. They had started believing their worth didn't come from outside. They had stopped apologizing. And in a village ruled by appearances, silence, and obedience, that was enough to be dangerous. As Clara prepared to leave, she turned and said, "There's more. One of the girls on the list, she's gone. No one knows where." Edith's stomach turned. Gone where? No one knows. Her parents said she left in the night, but I don't think she ran. The fear that had been building in Edith's chest broke open. She stood frozen long after Clara left. One girl taken for questioning. Another disappeared. A list growing longer. And behind it all, a system so old and deep that most people didn't even see it anymore. But now Edith did, clearly, and it was coming for her next. The house felt too quiet after Clara left. Edith sat by the fire, staring at the flames, but her mind wasn't still. She heard every sound in the walls, the creak of wood, the soft breath of wind under the door, her sister's footsteps above. She kept replaying Clara's words. A girl had vanished. No one knew where she went. No one was asking too loudly. It was the silence that disturbed Edith most. People knew what was happening. They felt it, but still they chose to say nothing, to pretend nothing had shifted. That was how fear worked. It didn't need to shout. It only needed to convince others to whisper. Marianne came down the stairs with a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her eyes were tired, but her face was softer than before. I had a dream, she said quietly, that I was running through the snow barefoot, and everyone was chasing me, but I didn't know why. I wasn't afraid, not really, just confused, like I'd forgotten something important. Edith looked at her, then gently held her hand. Maybe you were running towards something, not away. Marian didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. That night, Edith didn't sleep. She waited until her mother and brother were quiet in their rooms, then wrapped her shawl and stepped outside. The village was wrapped in pale moonlight, the snow glowing faintly like a blanket of silver. It was quiet, but not peaceful. A few lights still flickered in windows. Shadows moved behind curtains. She walked to the edge of the woods, where the trees bent low with snow. The cold bit at her fingers, but she didn't mind. She needed space. She needed to think without the weight of others' expectations pressing on her from every side. What did it mean to resist something you couldn't name? There were no laws written on stone, no open threats, just looks, whispers, missing girls, and a silence so thick it almost felt like snow in her lungs. She sat on a tree stump near the edge of the clearing and looked up at the stars. For a moment, everything was still. Then, out of the trees came footsteps. Her heart jumped, but she didn't move. Clara appeared, wrapped in her coat, a lantern in her hand. I thought you'd be here. Edith nodded. I couldn't stay inside. Clara set the lantern down beside her and sat close. For a while, they said nothing. Just breathed. Then Edith whispered, I keep thinking, what if they come to the house next? Clara looked down. They will. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Do you ever think about leaving? Edith asked. Just walking away from all of it? I did, Clara said softly. Right after they took Merwin. I thought if I go far enough, maybe I can start over. And why didn't you? Clara turned toward her. Because it's not just about me. If we all run, nothing changes. They'll keep doing this. Keep silencing people. Edith stared at her, a warmth rising behind her eyes. Not from the cold, but something sharper. Something real. I'm afraid, she admitted. So am I, Clara said. But being afraid doesn't mean we're wrong. They sat there for a long time, the moon casting shadows across the snow. Then Clara stood and took a folded cloth from her pocket. I have something. She handed it to Edith. Inside was a small stitched square, a piece of fabric carefully embroidered. A wildflower, blooming, stitched in thread the color of fire. I made it for the girl who disappeared, Clara said. I didn't know her well, but I wanted something to remember her by. Something quiet, but strong. Edith held the square gently in her hands. Maybe we can make more, Clara said. For each of us. A way to say, we're still here, even if no one else listens. Edith nodded. The cold didn't feel so sharp anymore. When she returned home, the sky was lightening. Morning would come soon, and with it, whatever came next. But as she tucked the stitched square into her pocket, she felt something steady growing inside her. Not anger, not rage, just the simple certainty that she would not be erased. Later that day, as snow began to fall again, Edith and Clara gathered with the others. Joan, Marianne, two more girls who had once been quiet but now stood taller, despite the fear. They met in a small loft above the Cooper's barn. Not to plan rebellion, not to shout, just to speak, to say aloud what had never been said. That they were tired of being small. That beauty wasn't obedience. That silence wasn't safety. Each girl brought a scrap of cloth, a thread, a quiet story. They stitched by lantern light, soft hands working with care. Not one of them said they weren't afraid, but still they stitched. For the girl who vanished. For Merwin. For each other. The sound of the needle passing through cloth became a kind of rhythm, steady, soft, strong. In that small space, surrounded by snow and silence, they were writing their own record. Not one that would be read aloud in the chapel, but one that lived in thread and breath and memory. When they left, each girl carried her square hidden in her coat. Just a piece of cloth, just a wildflower, but it meant more than any mirror ever had. And Edith, quiet, thoughtful Edith, walked home that night with her head lifted, her breath rising into the cold air like smoke. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but tonight, she wasn't afraid of being seen. The snow came thick the next morning, covering everything in soft layers that blurred the edges of roofs, trees, and footsteps. The village moved slower, the kind of slow that made people speak in low voices and take shorter steps. Life hadn't changed in a way that could be named, but something in the air had shifted. In the bakery, women spoke of the cold and the lack of eggs. At the well, the girls' voices were quieter, but their glances lingered longer, held deeper meanings. Something had been stirred, even if it had no name yet. At home, Edith helped her mother with the washing. They didn't speak much. The steam from the boiling water clouded the windows, and the scent of lye clung to the air. But Edith felt her mother watching her more closely than usual. Not unkindly, just curiously, like she was waiting for a question or a confession that never came. That afternoon, while hanging the damp linens by the fire, her mother finally spoke. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Edith paused. About what? Her mother didn't look up from the cloth she was folding. About what's been going on with the other girls. "I know something's different. I may not ask often, but I listen." Edith swallowed. She thought of all the times her mother had brushed her hair, pressed her dresses, reminded her to sit tall and speak softly. All the unspoken ways they'd both try to follow the script handed down to them. And now, something in her mother's tone said she knew the script was breaking. Edith sat beside her. "It's not rebellion. It's not dangerous. We just want to feel like we're allowed to be who we are, without being punished." Her mother was quiet for a while. Then, without looking at her, she said, "When I was your age, I wanted to paint. I used to crush flower petals and use them as color. But I stopped, because someone told me it wasn't what girls were meant to do." Edith blinked. "I don't remember who said it," her mother continued, "but I remember believing them." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The linens steamed gently, and the fire crackled low. Then her mother reached out and smoothed a loose strand of hair behind Edith's ear. "Just be careful. The world doesn't always listen kindly. But that doesn't mean you should stop speaking." Later that night, Edith placed her cloth square, the one Clara had given her, beside her bed. It was small and simple, but every thread in it held meaning. Not just for the girl who vanished, or for Merwin, or for Clara, but for herself. It was her proof that she had chosen to keep being herself, even when no one had asked her to. That week, another girl on the watch list, Elsa, stood up during chapel. Not loudly, not angrily. She simply stood when the priest began preaching again about obedience. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just remained standing, the entire sermon. And the next day, 2 more girls did the same. By the following week, there were 5. They never spoke. They didn't need to. The act itself was enough. Enough to say, "We are awake." The priest never named them, but his voice grew sharper, his sermons longer. The Baron's men returned once, briefly. They asked questions. They knocked on Merwin's door, now boarded shut. They asked after Clara, after Edith. But the villagers had grown quiet in a different way now. Not from fear, but from understanding. Not everyone agreed with the girls, but many had begun to see the cost of silence. Edith and the others continued meeting, not in secret, but quietly. They stitched new squares. They shared stories. Not every girl joined. Not every girl stayed. But those who did began walking taller. Not because they were proud, but because they had stopped shrinking. And Marianne, little by little, returned to herself. She started humming again when she cooked. She cut her hair shorter, saying it felt more like her. She asked Edith if she could make a cloth square too. The day she showed it, stitched with a small, curling fern, she smiled in a way Edith hadn't seen in weeks. "It's small," she said, "but I like it. "It's perfect," Edith replied. And it was. Spring crept in quietly, as if unsure if it would be welcomed. The snow melted slowly. The roads returned. The trees reached upward again, green buds peeking through like small promises. The girls still met, still stitched, but the fear had faded some. One morning, Clara and Edith walked together past the chapel. The priest stood near the steps, speaking to no one. His voice was softer now, not uncertain, just quieter. Clara smiled faintly. "Do you think he's tired?" Edith looked at the man who had once tried to contain them with words. She didn't feel anger anymore, just a kind of distant sadness. Maybe, or maybe he's just waiting for a new script. That afternoon, they brought their cloth squares to the edge of the woods. Not to bury them, not to burn them, just to hang them on the old pine tree, the one everyone passed on the road but never really saw. They tied them to the branches one by one. Dozens of wildflowers, ferns, leaves, waves. Threads in all colors. They moved slightly in the breeze. They didn't shout. They didn't explain. They simply left them there, where anyone could see. That night, as the moon rose, Edith sat by the fire, the window opened slightly to the fresh air. The world was still. The quiet was no longer heavy, just peaceful. She thought of how it had all started. With a burned cheek, a pale ribbon, a girl who felt like she was fading. And now here they were, still scared sometimes, still unsure, but no longer small. Edith closed her eyes. She knew that not everything had changed. There would still be people who wanted silence, who feared girls who asked too much. But there would also be more cloth squares, more girls who stood up in silence, more mothers who remembered dreams they had once folded away. And that was enough for now, because change, real change, never comes all at once. It comes in stitches, in footsteps, in breath, and in the quiet choice to be seen. The cloth squares stayed on the tree for weeks. At first, only the girls visited. They came one by one, slipping out early or walking there before sunset, just to see them swaying in the breeze. Sometimes, they left new ones, more careful stitches, small changes in color or design. Each one felt like a quiet voice added to a growing chorus, too soft to echo, but impossible to ignore once heard. Then others started noticing. A boy from the tannery passed the tree and paused. He didn't say anything, but the next day, a scrap of fabric appeared. No flower, just a simple spiral, drawn in dark thread. No one knew who left it. No one asked. The village baker's wife, a woman of 50 with a laugh that usually filled the street, walked past with her daughter and stood in front of the cloth for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But a week later, she wore a pin stitched in a familiar wildflower pattern on her apron. The change wasn't loud. It never had to be. It came in smaller things. One day, at the chapel, the priest read from his book, but didn't speak of vanity. He didn't mention obedience. He simply gave a sermon about patience, about kindness. His voice wasn't trembling, but it was softer. He looked at the pews differently now, as though unsure who might be listening in a new way. And perhaps he understood that silence could speak back. Girls still braided their hair, wore ribbons, and shared secrets behind sleeves. But there was something new in their posture now, a kind of peace or perhaps strength. They no longer seemed to look toward the barren suns for attention. They looked toward each other. One afternoon, Marianne pulled out the old mirror they had once shared. She placed it on the windowsill where the light came in best. She didn't hide it or cover it. She simply left it there, like it belonged, without needing to be worshipped. "I don't hate it anymore," she told Edith as they peeled apples together by the fire. Edith glanced up. "The mirror?" "No," Marianne said, smiling faintly. "Myself." They didn't talk much after that. There wasn't anything else to say. That spring, the village hosted its yearly gathering. It wasn't grand, just food laid out near the green, a few old songs played on flutes and string. But it was always a day people looked forward to. A day for new beginnings, they called it. This year, the girls came dressed, not in matching colors or silks borrowed from wealthier homes, but in their own clothes, plain and familiar. Each one wore a cloth square, stitched to their sleeve or tied to their hair. They didn't match. They weren't coordinated, but they were beautiful. Edith noticed it before anyone said a word. The way the men paused. The way the elder women leaned in. Something about these girls now, the ease in how they stood. The way they laughed with their whole faces, not just their mouths. The way they didn't shrink or seek approval. The difference wasn't in what they wore. It was in how they wore it. Near the edge of the gathering, the Baron Steward stood beside the mayor, watching the group quietly. He didn't speak. He didn't frown, just observed. Edith saw him nod once, as though noting something important, then turn and walk away. He did not return. That night, Edith sat with Clara under the oak tree. The leaves were just beginning to open again, bright green like the start of a page. "I never thought we'd change anything," Clara said, voice low. Edith smiled, watching the stars through the branches. "Maybe we didn't change the village. Maybe we just changed ourselves." Clara glanced at her. "And maybe that's enough." A breeze passed through the field, rustling the cloth squares still hanging on the pine tree nearby. Edith listened to them fluttering, like paper birds, delicate but alive. "You think the girl who vanished ever sees them?" Clara asked after a pause. Edith didn't answer right away. "I think, wherever she is, she knows someone remembers her." They stayed a little longer, neither of them saying much. Just being. As time passed, people stopped calling it a movement. They didn't call it anything at all. It simply became part of life. A girl stitched a square when she felt something she couldn't say. A mother passed her daughter a new needle when she saw her standing taller. A boy learned to listen better. A father asked a question and truly waited for the answer. Even Merwin's old cottage, once boarded and silent, found life again. Marianne visited it often. One day, she cleaned the hearth and left fresh herbs on the windowsill. A few weeks later, Clara found a girl reading aloud from one of the old recipe books near the stoop. People stopped calling the place cursed. And in time, they started calling it something else, the quiet house. Because that's what it gave people now, quiet. The kind that wasn't silence, but reflection, thought, peace. Years later, long after the cloth squares began to fade in the sun, a traveler passed through the village. He asked about the odd tree on the edge of the wood, covered in weathered bits of fabric. He wanted to know if it was a shrine or a place of mourning. The villagers smiled and told him it wasn't that. "It's where we remember," one woman said. "Remember what?" he asked. The woman shrugged gently. "What it felt like to choose who we are." And that was enough. The warmth of spring deepened, and with it came a strange calm. Not the kind that signals peace, but the kind that lingers after a storm when everyone wonders if it's truly over or if something else is waiting just out of sight. Edith had begun to move through her days with a little more ease. There were still small worries, like how often the steward walked past the green, or how some elders still tightened their mouths when they saw the girls laughing too freely. But things were better, lighter. Then, one late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows stretched long across the fields, a knock came at Edith's door. Her mother answered, then turned back into the kitchen pale and quiet. "They want to speak with you." The words landed like cold water. Edith stepped outside and saw two men. One was the steward, the other unfamiliar, cloaked in a deep gray coat with silver threading. His face was unreadable. He introduced himself simply as a visitor from the manor. That was all he said. He didn't ask harsh questions. He didn't raise his voice. He only invited her to come with them, to discuss some community matters. No explanation, no warning, and that made it worse. As she followed them through the village, Edith's eyes caught Clara's. She was standing near the well, a bucket in her hand, lips slightly parted in alarm. Edith didn't have time to say anything, only offered the smallest nod. One meant to say, "It's okay. I'll be fine." But she didn't feel fine. They led her past the green and up the hill toward the old watchtower that hadn't been used in years, except now it was. There were guards posted outside, quiet and stiff. Inside, the stone walls were damp and cold, and the windows were just thin slits of light. She was brought to a room with a table and a single chair. She sat. The man in gray stood in front of her for a while before speaking. Then finally, "We've noticed your name comes up often when the girls are mentioned." Edith didn't speak. "You don't preach. You don't lead chants. But you started something harder to name." He paused, and harder to stop. Edith tried to steady her voice. We haven't done anything wrong. The man tilted his head. You've done something more powerful than wrong. You've made them think they don't need to be quiet. There it was. The truth. It wasn't about laws. It was about control. About expectations being cracked just enough for others to peer through. He stepped closer. You're not being punished. Not yet. But this is your warning. Be careful with what you inspire. And then, just like that, he left. No threats. No commands. Only that soft, heavy message. She was let out in silence. When she returned home, the village was waiting. Not openly. No one stood in the street. But she saw them watching, waiting to see what kind of Edith had returned. She walked through the square slowly, feeling the weight of her own shadow. But then, from the chapel steps, someone moved. It was the priest. He walked down, met her eyes, and for the first time, nodded. Not in approval, not in victory, but something more uncertain. Respect, maybe, or acknowledgement. But just as Edith felt the tension beginning to slip from her shoulders, a voice rang out across the green. She's back. Everyone turned. A girl came running from the tree line. Mud on her boots, hair tangled, cheeks flushed red from cold and wind. It was the girl who had vanished. Elsa. People gasped. Some moved toward her, but she didn't stop for them. She ran straight to Edith and threw her arms around her. I didn't run, Elsa whispered, trembling. They took me. To scare others. To make me an example. But someone helped me escape. Edith pulled her back. Who? Elsa looked toward the edge of the village, and a figure stepped forward from behind the trees. Merwin. The old woman looked thinner, older, her cloak torn and patched, but her eyes burned bright. Clara cried out and ran to her. Others followed, but Merwin raised her hand for silence. I've kept quiet long enough, she said. They wanted me gone because I reminded your daughters what they already knew, that they are whole, that they do not need to be changed to be seen. The villagers stood in stunned silence, even those who had once doubted her. And then, from the back of the crowd, the unexpected happened. The Baron Steward stepped forward and said, We knew she escaped. But no one found her. His voice was tight. But someone helped her, he added. Edith turned slowly toward him. You? The man didn't answer. But the pause was enough. The tension cracked. Not loudly, not in shouts, but in the faces of the villagers who realized they were part of a bigger story than they'd thought. That fear had been used to hold them in place. That maybe they had let it go too far. Later that night, fires were lit. Not in protest, but in warmth. The square filled again, not with rules or speeches, but with laughter, quiet song, and stories that had waited too long to be told. Girls brought out their cloth squares and stitched them onto one long banner. They didn't ask for permission. Edith sat beside Merwin and Elsa, watching the flames reflect in their eyes. I thought it would be harder, she whispered. Merwin smiled. It always is. But sometimes, all it takes is one moment of truth. Edith looked at the others, each face glowing in the firelight. And sometimes, she added, all it takes is being seen. And just as the warmth of the fire reached its fullest, Clara leaned toward her, voice low, one final twist slipping softly into her ear. You know the man in gray? She asked. The one who warned you? Edith nodded. He's the Baron's son. Edith blinked. Clara smiled faintly. Looks like we made someone else think, too. And under that silent night sky, filled with stars and smoke, Edith laughed. Not from relief, but from knowing it had all been worth it. They hadn't just changed the village. They'd reminded it how to feel alive again. The next morning, the village woke slowly, as though the night before had left something heavy and tender in the air. No one spoke too loudly. Even the roosters crowed a little late. Smoke drifted up from chimneys like threads, pulled gently into the sky. Edith stood by the window, holding her tea close. Outside, children were already running down the road, their boots splashing through soft puddles left by melting snow. The cloth banner, now full with stitched squares and quiet symbols, still hung in the square, dancing in the breeze. She hadn't expected the village to change so quickly. She hadn't expected it to change at all. But something in the silence was different now. It wasn't afraid anymore. It was listening. Later that morning, Merwin came to visit. She didn't knock. She simply stepped inside like she used to, the way people do when their absence was never truly accepted. Edith's mother poured tea without question. No one spoke of what had happened. Not yet. They sat around the hearth. Edith, Merwin, and Marianne. I didn't leave because I wanted to, Merwin said. I left because I was told there was no space left for what I offered. That teaching girls to be steady, to trust their thoughts and their instincts, was dangerous. But you came back, Marianne said softly. Merwin looked at her with tired but smiling eyes. Because I knew one of you would be brave enough to pull open the silence. Edith didn't speak. She just held the cup close and listened to the fire breathe between them. The visit was quiet, but it didn't need to be loud. It was enough to simply sit, to be together again, to know that what had been taken didn't have to stay gone. That afternoon, word began to spread, slowly, gently, that the steward had been reassigned. No official reason, no explanation, just a quiet change, as if the manor had chosen to let things settle on their own. A younger clerk was sent in his place. He wore no silver embroidery and asked no questions. And that perhaps was the greatest relief of all. Elsa, the girl who had disappeared, stayed with Clara's family for a while. Her parents welcomed her, but couldn't quite meet her eyes yet. It was hard for them. They'd been told to believe her absence was a shame. They'd spent weeks telling themselves it was her fault. Now, having her home again made those thoughts feel hollow. But each day, they softened a little more. And each day, Elsa looked a little more like herself again. Joan and the other girls decided to take their stitch banner to the chapel one morning. They laid it gently at the altar, not in anger, not as challenge, but as offering. A quiet reminder that the prayers of the village had always lived in more places than the pages of one book. The priest didn't remove it. He left it where it was. From then on, the banner stayed, sometimes folded neatly, sometimes stretched out on the benches near the back. It faded a little with time, but no one forgot what it had meant. By midsummer, wildflowers grew again on the edge of the woods. Clara and Edith began gathering them with other girls, weaving them into crowns, placing them on windowsills and doorsteps. No one told them to stop. No one called improper. Even the older women, who once warned of vanity and pride, started to join them. At first, they only watched. Then they picked stems of their own. Eventually, someone began teaching the younger ones which flowers heal burns, which soothe headaches. These old practices, once nearly forgotten, quietly came back to life. And with them came something else, joy. Not the loud, fleeting kind, but the quiet kind that settles in bones. The kind that isn't always noticed until it fills a room. One evening, Edith found herself walking alone through the village. The air was soft with twilight. Lanterns flickered from open windows, and she could hear someone singing in the distance. An old song, slow and warm. She passed the tree where the first cloth squares had been hung. Many were faded now, their threads softened by sun and rain. But still they moved with the breeze. She paused, reached in her pocket, and pulled out a new one, deep blue, with a white moon stitched in the center. No one had seen it yet. She tied it gently to the branch and stepped back. This one wasn't for rebellion, or memory, or even loss. It was just for peace, for the simple, quiet courage of choosing to stay kind. As she turned to walk back, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Clara, smiling. "I knew I'd find you here." Edith smiled. "It's quiet now." Clara nodded, but not empty. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, letting the last light of the day wrap around them like a blanket. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to, because this was no longer a story about fear. It was a story about choosing gentleness, even when the world pushed the other way. About girls who remembered who they were before they were told what they should be. And about a village that slowly, quietly, remembered too. Summer moved slowly through the village, warming the stones and softening the corners of every day. The fields stretched wide with green, and the air smelled of lavender and bread. Birds nested above doorways. Children played barefoot by the riverbank, and the evenings were long enough to sit under the sky without lamps for hours. No one really spoke of the change anymore. It didn't need to be spoken. It was felt in gestures. A woman brushing her daughter's cheek without telling her to fix her hair, a man asking his sister's opinion without mockery, a girl standing straight in the market, even when no one was looking. These were the new patterns. Subtle but real. Edith spent more time in the woods these days. Not to hide, but to think. The space between the trees felt sacred in a way she hadn't understood before. It was where the noise of the village faded, where thoughts became clearer and slower. Sometimes she picked herbs again, not because she had to, but because it reminded her of Merwin, of learning to see the small power in the natural world, in roots and leaves, in things that grow quietly. She often found Clara there too, sitting on a log with her feet in the stream, or laying back in the moss with her eyes half closed. They didn't always talk. Sometimes just being nearby was enough. Once, Clara said, "We should write it down. All of it. So no one forgets." Edith looked at her. "You think someone might?" Clara didn't answer for a moment. Time smooths things. The sharper parts get rounded off. People start to tell it simpler than it was. Edith nodded. She'd seen it already. How people who had once been silent now smiled and claimed they'd always believed the girls were right. How the steward's cruelty became just strictness. How Merwin's exile was called a misunderstanding. It wasn't unkindness. It was just how memory worked. That night, Edith began to write. Just a little. On rough paper with uneven ink. Not for the village, not for praise, just for the truth. She wrote about the cold winter when the mirror cracked. About the way it felt to see Marianne stop speaking. About the cloth square that Clara stitched in silence. About Elsa's return and the firelight that made Merwin's face glow like someone stepping out a legend. Each word felt like placing a stone on a path. Something solid, something real. In time, others wrote too. Joan wrote poems, some funny, some quiet. Marianne began drawing again. Faces of girls in the village, some real, some imagined. Clara copied herbal recipes from memory. Together, they gathered it all in a worn leather book they kept in Merwin's cottage, now open to anyone who wished to read or add their own page. The younger girls, who hadn't lived through the hard part, came to call the book the soft record, not because it was weak, but because it told the truth in a gentle voice. The truth, they learned, didn't need to shout to be strong. Autumn arrived with gold leaves and heavy skies. The harvest was good that year. The baker's wife made spice pies and gave one to every girl who had stitched a square. The priest, older now and slower, began asking girls to read aloud during chapel. No one forced them to, but many chose to. They spoke in clear voices, sometimes about faith, sometimes about quiet strength, sometimes about kindness that took longer to grow. One morning, Edith awoke to find a letter at her door. It wasn't sealed, just folded neatly with her name written on the outside in careful hand. Inside was a short message. "You may not know this, but you gave me the courage to look in the mirror again. Not to check if I was beautiful, but to see myself with softer eyes. Thank you." There was no signature. She kept the letter in her drawer. As the seasons turned, life didn't become perfect. There were still arguments. Still traditions that pressed too hard. Still old ideas that clung to corners like dust in a room no one cleaned often. But the difference now was choice. Girls could speak and be heard. Mothers remembered who they had once been. And fathers, slowly, began to see their daughters not as pieces to be polished, but as whole people with full thoughts, full hearts. Even the boys began to change. One day, a young boy, no older than 12, brought Edith a square he had stitched himself. It was uneven and slightly frayed, but it held a sun in yellow thread. "For my sister," he said shyly. "She doesn't talk much, but I think this might help." Edith smiled and nodded. "It will." The tree at the edge of the woods grew heavier with cloth. The oldest ones turned to pale shades of their original colors. Some fell away in the wind, but new ones always appeared. A ribbon here, a thread there, sometimes stitched, sometimes tied in a simple knot. No longer a secret, now a tradition. And Merwin, who had once been banished, became something like a grandmother to all. Not in title, but in spirit. She taught again, not as a healer or a leader, just as someone who had seen what happened when girls were not allowed to grow. One cold morning, she sat with Edith near the old hearth and said, "I used to think wisdom had to come with age. But I see now it just needs honesty. Edith smiled. Then the young are already wiser than most. Merwin laughed. Perhaps. Later that year, a traveler passed through the village again. A different one from before. She stayed one night, then asked at the market, "Why does it feel so easy here? Like nothing's heavy." No one gave her a full answer. But one girl pointed to the tree, another to the chapel banner, and a third to the house with a blue moon stitched on the door. The traveler nodded slowly. "I see. This is a place where softness survived." And it had, because someone remembered to protect it, because someone was brave enough to speak, because someone listened. Winter returned, this time not with fear, but with softness. Snow fell in slow curtains over the rooftops, clinging to the edges of windows and fences, making the village seem quiet again, but not in the same way it had felt before. It wasn't silence born of unease. It was rest, like the village itself had finally exhaled. Edith found herself walking more slowly. She paused to watch icicles drip from the corners of houses, or to listen to the wind rustle through the bare trees. Children laughed as they chased each other with mittened hands, and even the elders, wrapped in heavy cloaks, seemed lighter somehow. One evening, she stepped into Merwin's old cottage, which no longer felt like a relic. It had become a place of gathering, of warmth and learning. The small hearth crackled, and the book, the soft record, rested open on the table, its pages gently curling from the heat. Inside were new entries. A mother had written about her daughter's first stitch square. A young boy had drawn a bird. A girl named Lita had written a poem about a field of stars, and how dreams often began with the smallest flicker. Edith smiled and added her own line beneath it. Sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that last the longest. Later that week, Marian asked if they could hang lanterns in the trees for the midwinter night. "Not for a festival," she said. "Just something to remind us that light is still here, even when the days are short." And so they did. The village gathered beneath the trees as the sky turned deep blue. One by one, lanterns were lit, simple things made of paper and string, glowing with soft orange light. They didn't speak much. They just stood together, watching the lights sway gently in the breeze. Clara stood beside Edith, her scarf wrapped high, cheeks red from the cold. "Do you remember how we used to be afraid of being seen?" "I do," Edith said. "Feels strange now. Like remembering a dream." "A bad one," Edith added softly. Clara turned to her. "But we woke up." Above them, the lanterns glowed like stars caught in branches. Children held hands. The old priest, wrapped in heavy wool, stood with the baker's wife, smiling quietly. No one gave orders. No one gave speeches. They just were. After that night, the lanterns stayed through the season. Some fell in windstorms. Some froze in the snow. But others stayed, glowing faintly even during the day, a reminder that what had been broken could be rebuilt. Edith's days became simple again. Cooking, tending the fire, helping in the garden when it wasn't too frozen. But there was a richness to it now. Conversations were deeper. People didn't glance away so quickly. Girls asked more questions. And when they laughed, it wasn't guarded. One morning, she received another letter. This one folded more carefully, with her name written in straighter lines. Inside was a message in a child's hand. "When I grow up, I want to make cloth squares like you. Mama said you help people feel less afraid to be themselves. I want to do that too." There's a drawing of a girl beside a tree, cloths blowing behind her. Edith kept that letter too. Years passed slowly, and the changes stayed. Not loud, not flashy, just steady. The tree at the edge of the woods eventually grew too heavy for the oldest cloths, and one spring, a windstorm carried many away. People thought it might be time to remove the rest, but instead, they decided to move them, to press each square between pages of a book, carefully cataloged by date and memory. It was stored in the chapel, not because the chapel had changed, but because the people had, and that made all the difference. Edith never married. It was never something she longed for. Not out of bitterness, just peace. She filled her life with other things. Her sister, her friends, letters, stories, and walks through the fields at dawn, where she sometimes saw girls wearing scarves stitched with wildflowers, symbols that no one questioned anymore. The house she grew up in changed too. Her mother became softer with time. She let go of the old rules, one by one, until the air in the house didn't feel so heavy. They still spoke carefully, but now it was out of kindness, not fear. And Marianne? She opened a small apothecary beside the square, where she taught young girls how to dry herbs, how to listen to their bodies, how to understand their own rhythms. She no longer hid. Her silence had become wisdom, her gentleness a guide. One quiet evening, long after the lanterns had become tradition and the cloths had been moved from the tree to the chapel pages, Edith sat in the garden with Clara. They were older now, lines near their eyes, slower in their steps, but still the same. Clara held a cup of warm tea and looked toward the sunset. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Miss what?" "The way things used to be." Edith thought for a while. "No, but I do remember it, and I'm glad we didn't let it stay that way." Clara smiled and leaned back in her chair. "We were brave. We were," Edith said. They sat quietly as the last light faded from the sky, the stars beginning to appear one by one. It was calm, the kind of calm that only comes after something has been faced, not avoided. The kind that lives not in silence, but in understanding. And when Edith finally rose to go inside, she looked back once more at the cloth square, still hanging on her garden gate. A blue moon. Its edges were worn now, the thread slightly faded, but it was still there, still seen, still soft, still enough. The next morning came slowly, with a pale sky and a cold hush that blanketed the village. Snow clung to the trees like lace, and the silence was deep but peaceful. Edith woke with a strange stillness in her chest. Not fear, not joy, but something in between. Something like calm after the storm. Word had already spread about Merwin's return and Elsa's escape. No one rang bells or made speeches, but you could feel it in the air. People walked differently now. They paused longer before speaking. They listened closer. There was a gentler rhythm to the village. It was as if everyone had finally seen something they could no longer ignore. Edith stood by the window and watched as children ran down the snowy path, their boots leaving prints that would disappear by noon. Elsa had stayed the night with Clara's family, and Clara sent word early. They were safe, warm, and together. Just knowing that settled something deep inside Edith. For so long, everything had felt like a question with no answer. But now, at last, things made a little more sense. Later in the day, the banner of stitched cloth squares was moved into the chapel. No one told the priest to do it. He did it himself. He folded it carefully and laid it across the front pew, not as a protest, but as a quiet offering. A sign that things could be different. A sign that maybe he, too, had listened. Some people were unsure at first. They asked questions, not cruel ones, just uncertain. What did it all mean? Why cloth squares? What were the girls trying to say? And slowly, the answers came, not through lectures, but through stories. Clara told hers near the well one afternoon. Marianne shared hers in the apothecary with a soft-spoken mother. Joan wrote hers into a poem and tied it to the tree with blue thread. The answers were different, but the feeling was the same. They weren't trying to overthrow anything. They were simply asking to be allowed to exist as they were. Edith spent more time in the woods again. The snow there was thick and untouched, and the quiet between the trees felt healing. Merwin joined her sometimes. They didn't talk much. They just walked together like they had in the past. One afternoon, Merwin turned to her and said, "I used to think my time had passed, that all I had to give had already been spent. But seeing these girls, seeing you, I know now that nothing ever really ends. It just changes shape." Edith smiled. She had felt it too. That shift, that quiet new strength growing like moss across old stones. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it, made space for something better. Marian slowly came back to life. Her laughter returned, soft at first, then brighter. She wore the cloth square Edith had given her around her wrist, not to make a statement, but to remind herself of the moment she chose to stop hiding. Her mother stopped warning her about appearances. Her father no longer said she was too quiet. They didn't always understand her, but they began to respect her. The girls kept meeting, not in secret now, but openly in the small clearing near the pine tree. They stitched, they shared tea, they told each other the truth. New girls joined. Some left, but the heart of it remained. It was never about rebellion. It was about remembering who you were before the world told you to be someone else. One day, Clara and Edith walked up the hill behind the village, where the wind was strong and the sky open wide. They sat together on the grass, cheeks pink from the cold. Clara looked out across the roofs and said, "I think we started something that won't end with us." Edith nodded. "We didn't ask for change. We just asked to be seen. And now, even the quietest girls know they can be." Below them, smoke curled from chimneys. A group of younger children played near the well. A boy handed a girl a thread of red cloth, and she tied it around her wrist with a grin. No one laughed. No one looked away. The priest began inviting girls to read from Scripture, not to control their voices, but to hear them. The mayor's wife joined one of the stitching circles. The baron never returned, and the man in gray faded into a story of a time the village had to choose what kind of place it wanted to be. Merwin's house stayed open, not as a shop, not as a school, just as a place where people could come and be. This soft record, as they began to call it, grew. Page after page of stitch patterns, journal entries, drawings, questions. It wasn't official, but it mattered. It was a living memory, held together not by rules but by care. By the time spring returned, the ground had thawed, and the girls planted wildflowers along the edge of the woods. The cloths on the pine tree remained, faded now but still there, fluttering like whispers in the breeze. A few boys had added squares too, crooked, funny, sincere. No one laughed. Edith started writing again, in a small book of her own. She didn't plan to publish it or share it widely. It was just for her to remember. She wrote about the cold, the quiet, the mirror, the voice inside her that wouldn't stop asking questions. She wrote about how it felt to finally be heard. Years passed, not quickly but fully, and the village kept its shape while its spirit changed. A place that once punished softness now protected it. A place where beauty had been a burden now welcomed it in many forms. Edith remained in the village. She never left. She didn't need to. Every season brought new girls with new questions, and she welcomed them all. Sometimes she taught them to stitch. Sometimes she just listened. In time, no one needed the squares to prove their worth anymore. But people made them anyway, not as resistance, but as celebration. The final cloth Edith made was pale green, with a single tree stitched in brown and gold. She tied it gently to the branch of the old pine, right at the center. It was simple, but like every square before it, it held something real. A choice, a voice, a memory, and a hope that even the softest threads could hold a story strong enough to carry forward. Because beauty was never just about mirrors or rules. It was always about seeing each other truly and never looking away. And in this quiet village, with its threadbare banners and wildflower paths, that truth would never be forgotten. Not again. Not ever.